Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
Lisa Cook says she will uphold independence as long as she is at the Fed. Welcome to the Wednesday edition as Cook issues a statement following arguments before the Supreme Court this morning over the president's attempted firing of Cook. And we're going to have a live report coming up from the Supreme Court with insights ahead from Lael, Brainard, the former director of the National Economic Council in the Biden administration, former vice chair of Federal Reserve, with us here in our Washington bureau. President Trump spoke for over an hour this morning at Davos, but only one line seemed to really matter to the market as he ruled out military force in Greenland. Thanks for being with us on the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, streaming live right now on YouTube. We have a lot to talk about following the president's address in Davos this morning, his ruling out of military activity in Greenland, and of course, the conversation about affordability that he tried to inject into that speech, his claims of economic growth. All will be tested when we spend some time with Lael Brainard, but we've also got our eyes on the Supreme Court today, and there is some major crossover here as the court weighs a very simple question: whether President Trump can fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook over mortgage fraud allegations that, of course, she has consistently denied. We heard the president's side of this case, speaking for the administration, Solicitor General John Sauer, in arguments just a couple of hours ago. Listen.
We would contend there's judicial review kind of at the outer perimeters of cause, whether that something goes to conduct, fitness, ability, or competence at all. But once you're within that, and we clearly are here, then there would be deference to the president. The statutory language, cause without further qualification, is itself, in its plain language, a broad, conferral of authority on the president himself.
Remembering that the Federal Reserve has been qualified as a different entity than every other federal agency in the court's declaration last May, describing it as a uniquely structured quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of the first and second banks of the United States. As we try to get closer to the center of this case, we bring in Tyler Kendall, Bloomberg Washington correspondent, has spent the day at the courthouse listening to arguments. Tyler, the headline that we're running here on the terminal is that justices are skeptical of the White House's case. What are you hearing?
Right, exactly, Joe. And that was the indication that we got as we listened to the justices questioning not just of the Solicitor General, but also of Lisa Cook's lawyer as well, signaling this weariness over the Trump administration's efforts to oust Fed Governor Lisa Cook and citing, interestingly enough, the potential ripple impacts when it comes to the economy, the markets, and of course, the central bank's independence. Now, if we take a step back here, it's important to note that the case in front of the Supreme Court today has to do with the Trump administration's request for what's known as a stay of a preliminary injunction that has allowed Lisa Cook to retain her position while the broader issue of her firing plays out in court. So essentially, they're asking the justices if President Trump can fire Lisa Cook for now. However, it does have implications for down the road because the justices were really asking questions that get to the heart of Lisa Cook's firing. And those themes that we saw the justices pull on really have to do with three different buckets. One is, does President Trump have sufficient cause to fire Cook? The second is, was she afforded due process? And the third are these potential impacts down the road when it comes to the economy and the central bank's independence. And it was interesting because we did hear from one of those justices appointed by President Trump, Brett Kavanaugh, who in particular honed in on that last bucket about what those impacts could be, saying that he is thinking about the, quote, real world downstream effects and any precedent that this could set, not just for the future of the Trump administration, but any administration down the line. So, Joe, well, it seemed that we were getting this sort of consensus for how the justices were feeling. There was less of a consensus about what they're going to do next. We could see them issue perhaps a narrow ruling citing concerns that Lisa Cook didn't have enough time to address these allegations of mortgage fraud against her. We could see a broader ruling where they define what cause means, what that legal standard actually should be defined as, since it's not explicitly known in the law. Or ultimately, Joe, they could just kick this back to the lower court and not issue an opinion at all. So there's a lot of different threads that we're watching here, and it's something that's going to develop in the weeks and months to come.
All right, Tyler, before you blow away, just very quickly, did you get eyes on Jay Powell? Did anybody see him coming out of the Supreme Court today?
So we can confirm one of our colleagues inside the room did lay eyes on Jerome Powell as well as Ben Bernanke. He was also in the room alongside Fed Governor Lisa Cook. However, it's our understanding that he did not go out of the main public entrance here. There's a few different entrances at the Supreme Court that Jerome Powell could have used.
Got it. Tyler, thank you. Get warm. Tyler Kendall in front of the U.S. Supreme Court today with arguments being had. We discussed this a bit with Kevin Hassett earlier, my colleague Anne-Marie Hordern, bringing us back to our other big story today, the president, the administration on the ground in Davos. And we spoke with Kevin Hassett, director of the National Economic Council, said to be on the short list to replace Jay Powell as Fed chair, specific to the concept of Fed independence. Listen to what he said.
I was a young economist at the Fed a long time ago, and I worked with Alan Greenspan, and he was really, really careful about keeping the Fed out of politics and keeping the Fed focused on monetary policy and interest rates and the dual mandate. And even to one point, I wrote a paper, an academic paper, that he refused to publish for the Fed for over a year because it was about carbon taxes and BTU taxes, and he didn't want the Fed to get involved in that fight with Al Gore and Bill Clinton while it was still going on. And so I think that, really regrettably, the bank presidents and the Federal Reserve members seem to want to have an opinion about everything every day, not just monetary policy. So, for example, you could go in, and right after President Trump took office, Austin Goolsbee gave a speech where he said, well, economists all agree that if there's a tariff, that it doesn't have an effect on inflation, it just affects the price level. But he said, here's why you shouldn't think about it that way. And I think that that's actually going into a politically dangerous place for the Fed. I mean, for sure you want to talk about inflation, but precisely then, right when President Trump's coming in and setting his tariff agenda, to have the Fed criticize him so vehemently, I think is inconsistent with the desire for independence.
Do you think it was appropriate that Jay Powell went to the Supreme Court today?
I do not.
Interesting. He did not think it was appropriate. As we heard, Jay Powell was in fact there, and that's Kevin Hassett speaking with Anne-Marie Hordern. After sundown in Davos, the president still making his way through the World Economic Forum, and we might catch him at a couple of different events. He's got some sideline meetings with other world leaders following his conversation with business leaders that just concluded, so we'll let you know if he starts to speak and make some news. We want to seize on this moment, though, following the arguments before the Supreme Court, knowing that we have a lot to talk about with our economy, and a special conversation with Lael Brainard. If there was one voice we wanted to hear respond to the president and this entire conversation about Lisa Cook's possible firing, we turn to the former director of the National Economic Council in the Biden administration, former vice chair of the Federal Reserve, distinguished fellow now at the Georgetown Soros Center for Financial Markets and Policy. Lael Brainard, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's great to see you. Can I just start with what happened at the Supreme Court today? Did you think it was appropriate for Jay Powell to be in attendance?
Look, I don't know whether it's appropriate, not appropriate, but I do know Treasury Secretary Bessent showed up when there were debates over tariffs.
He sure did.
And could anything be more important to the Federal Reserve Chair right now than how the Supreme Court delineates the president's authorities on for-cause firing of board members?
Yeah. Well, look, this is obviously something that will not be resolved today, and we understand it could be months before we know. Lisa Cook did issue a statement following the arguments this morning and talked about the insulation that Congress has put together to insulate the Fed from political threats, holding it accountable for delivering on the mandate. For as long as I serve at the Federal Reserve, she writes, I will uphold the principle of political independence in service to the American people. We could be in a world where she has another 3 or 4 Fed meetings before this case is decided. Should she be in those meetings?
Well, look, I think what Justice Kavanaugh got to in his questioning, which is if a governor can be fired without any hearing, without any due process, without any real establishment of for cause, it really fundamentally means that the American economy can be in for higher inflation, less credibility on the part of the central bank, because that is what central bank independence is so important for. So I do think this issue about making sure that the president's ability to fire for cause is carefully delineated, because otherwise we will lose that fundamental bedrock of the American economic dynamism.
I want to get your take on the state of the economy, but as long as we're talking about this, you have the case involving Lisa Cook, and you now have a criminal investigation into Chairman Jay Powell. What is it that the president is trying to do in reshaping the Fed, if nothing short of that?
Yeah, well, I think really the criminal investigation just seems like a spectacular misstep on his part. If anything, it has really raised concerns. We've heard from financial market leaders. We have now heard from prominent Senate Republicans who sit on the Senate Banking Committee. The move to criminally investigate the chair for some renovations has really, I think, set off alarm bells that could lead to the chair staying in his seat as governor for longer than he might have done otherwise.
Right. Isn't that something? We had Tom Tillis on the program last week under no uncertain terms. Says he will not consider a replacement until this is resolved. As we spend time with Lael Brainard, I want to go through some of the notes that I took during the president's address today before this crowd in Davos that I think we can agree knows a lot about the data. They probably have a couple Bloomberg terminals in that room. These are business leaders. These are world leaders who were listening to the president. Inflation has been defeated. Is that true?
Well, I think we know that inflation is still hovering close to 3%. We'll get the PCE inflation later, but inflation has not been defeated. Inflation close to 3% is not close to the Fed's target. There's more work to be done there.
The bold claim. Virtually no inflation, he says, and extraordinarily high economic growth. Over the past 3 months, he says core inflation has been 1.6%. He's projecting economic growth in the fourth quarter of almost 5.5%. Will that happen?
Seems very implausible. Don't forget, we had the shutdown in the fourth quarter, and that's likely to depress growth in the fourth quarter. Of course, we'll see a bounce back from that in the first quarter. He's right that we've had several quarters of very strong growth. That has been entirely propelled by the private sector AI boom. But if you look at jobs, it's been entirely jobless growth. So the rate of job creation has really plummeted during this time. And of course, with inflation still high, that's why you see consumer sentiment that's still very glum.
The president said people are doing very well. They're very happy with me. We've lifted more than 1.2 million people off of food stamps. How do you interpret those lines?
So, look, I think the polling, similar to the consumer sentiment data, suggests that actually there has been a precipitous decline in sentiment about the economy. And what we've seen in some recent elections is that a lot of Americans want the president to deliver on his promise to bring down prices on day one. Instead, prices have gone up a lot, and people are very concerned about affordability.
Well, and you wonder as well, the 1.2 million people off of food stamps, is that because of the changes in eligibility, or is it because people are lifting themselves up with new jobs or higher wages?
Well, we certainly know that the Big Beautiful Bill had restrictions on SNAP, food benefits that have been calamitous for many American families. And of course, the Medicaid cuts, 11 to 13 million Americans that will potentially lose access. That won't kick in until after the midterms. But I think a lot of families are also already seeing the premium tax credits expiration means that they are paying double the premiums on their health insurance for another up to 20 million Americans.
And this may not be changing anytime soon as we watch the beat here, try to follow the beat on Capitol Hill. I want to ask you about housing. Really interesting. The president wants to ban institutional buyers from the single-family home market. That's one initiative that's been fixed. I suspect that'll be part of the State of the Union address. But he's been recently talking about his concerns over rating people's nest eggs in their homes, that making changes to the market could lower their home values. Listen to the president talking about this earlier in Davos.
Every time you make it more and more and more affordable for somebody to buy a house cheaply, you're actually hurting the value of those houses. Now, if I want to really crush the housing market, I could do that so fast that people could buy houses, but you would destroy a lot of people that already have houses.
I'm really curious your thoughts on this. Number one, I don't know how fast he could start building tens of millions of homes that I guess would be needed to actually lower home values. But how destructive would this be to people's savings?
Look, I think it was interesting, as you say, to hear him just reflect aloud. It seems like he's got some real ambivalence. Most Americans don't have a lot of ambivalence. They really do. They're hurting. Rent is too high. They want to own homes, young families, first-time home owners who are aspirational. They've been locked out of the market for too long, and we know that the answer is more housing to be built. We are short 3 to 4 million units of housing at a minimum. And so in order to do that, a very forceful and long-term agenda needs to be put in place. The Senate actually had some good legislation, the road to affordability on housing. I think there's a lot of good ideas out there, but it really has to go beyond a few Band-Aids and take seriously the need for more supply.
It would take a lot to lower housing values. I suspect that would dent people's retirements, although we've been through a great recession before, and we've seen the housing market go through some pretty wild swings. Lastly, we have a minute left. Interest rates. The president says in the old days you had big numbers, they lowered rates. He doesn't understand the dynamic here with the Fed. We don't have time to get into all of that, but do you see a Federal Reserve that's on the precipice of cutting rates again?
So I think it'll all depend on the data. I actually think that this Federal Reserve is focused on the data. We have seen that the unemployment rate has held steady now. They were extremely concerned about a weakening labor market. For a month or two, we've seen some reassuring data there, which means they can take a little longer and see how those inflation numbers really play out. But if the president continues to threaten the Fed's independence, interest rates will actually go up.
Well, we've seen that a bit on the long end, haven't we? It's great to have you back with us. Lael Brainard, I didn't even ask you who should be the next Fed chair. You wouldn't tell me, though, would you?
I would not.
She's been in the building, vice chair at the Federal Reserve, and of course, former director of the National Economic Council, Lael Brainard, with us in studio here at Bloomberg. We thank you for the insights, and we'll assemble our panel next. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. We want to bring you back to Davos, as I just mentioned. Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, sitting down for a bilateral meeting with President Trump, remembering that President Trump saying earlier today he did not believe NATO nations would back the United States if attacked. Let's listen live now on Bloomberg.
It's been amazing. As you know, we're staying, and tomorrow we're doing something else having to do with the border peace. We're getting tremendous acceptance of that. It's going to be great. So we'll see how that all works out, but we're doing that tomorrow. So thank you very much, media. Thank you very much. And Mark, would you
Yeah, just briefly, what I just wanted to say again, as I did this morning when I was in a panel, I want to thank you again for what you did since coming in January, Trump 47. Basically getting the Europeans and Canada to really step up, and that led to the enormous success we had in The Hague with the 5%, which is crucial to defend ourselves and to also equalize with what the US is paying. This was a problem already there since Eisenhower. I always tell the Europeans, you are completely committed to NATO, but there is also that one irritant, and it is this factor, that the Europeans were not paying the same as the US was paying. And we solved it, and this is crucial also because we need the money to protect ourselves. There's one thing I heard you say yesterday and today. You were not absolutely sure that the Europeans would come to the rescue of the US if you will be attacked. Let me tell you, they will. And they did in Afghanistan, as you know, for every American who paid the ultimate, for every 2 Americans who paid the ultimate price, there was one soldier from another NATO country who did not come back to his family. From the Netherlands, from Denmark, particularly, from other countries. So you can be assured, absolutely, if ever the US will be under attack, your allies will be with you. Absolutely, there's an absolute guarantee. I really want to tell you this because it is important. It pains me if you think it is not. And under your leadership, this alliance is stronger than ever.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great compliment. Any questions?
Mr. President, the Danish foreign minister rejected your call to negotiate on Greenland. What will
I didn't call him.
No, sorry. The Danish foreign minister rejected what you said in your speech, that you were hoping to negotiate to acquire Greenland, essentially saying that this is not something that they are willing to discuss. So what will those negotiations
Well, they
look
didn't
like?
tell me that, so when they tell me, because I don't like getting it secondhand. If he wants to tell me, he'll tell me that to my face.
And when will you be discussing this?
I have no idea.
When you said you
I'll be discussing it with this man right here.
Mr. President,
He's frankly more important.
Mr. President, when you said you would remember if Denmark did not agree to a deal on Greenland. What did you mean? What are the consequences?
You'll have to figure that out for yourself. You're a smart guy.
Mr. President, do you see a price for Greenland that's reasonable?
I could see that, yeah.
How would you calculate
I could see that, but there's a bigger price, and that's the price of safety and security and national security and international security, having to do with many of your countries. Mm-hmm. That's really the price, and that's the big price. And as you know, we're doing the Golden Dome. It's going to be very expensive, and it's better if we have Greenland than it is without. It's going to be safer. It's going to be stronger. It's going to be better for Europe, and it's going to be better for us. And so we'll see what happens. Any other question?
Is it reassuring to hear the NATO Secretary General say NATO will defend the United States if it comes under attack?
Well, I hope that that's true. I mean, he's a good man. He's never lied to me before. You know, we've had a good relationship, and he made that statement. That's nice. I mean, I just, you know, when I see what's happening with Greenland, I wonder, because I want Greenland for security. I don't want it for anything else. We have so much rare earth. We don't know what to do with it. We don't need it for anything else. And in terms of Greenland, you know, you have to go 25 feet down through ice to get it. It's not something that a lot of people are going to do or want to do. No, this is security we're talking about. And I can say one thing about Mark. He wants security, and he wants security for all of us. I think it's, you know, we're a member of NATO. He wants security for NATO and beyond. So when he says that, Steve, I think it's, you know, it's very nice. Okay? Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Press. Thank you, Press.
Thank you.
Thank you, Press. Thank you, Press. Let's go. Let's go. Start moving. Thank you, Press.
All right. A live conversation there with President Trump and the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, who said, "You can be assured absolutely," this is Rutte speaking, "if ever the U.S. was under attack, your allies will be with you." He added, "It pains me if you think that's not so." Following the president's remarks earlier at the World Economic Forum, in which he said flat out he does not believe that our NATO allies would be there to help support the United States if attacked, if there was in fact an Article 5 violation, knowing that the only time there ever has been one was on behalf of the United States following 9/11. And of course, Denmark did send troops who died in Afghanistan. Let's assemble our political panel to get their take on the comments from the president so far today in Davos, and we're not done yet. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis are with us. Jeanne is Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Rick, our Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital. Jeanne, the president, after the Secretary General of NATO just made that pronouncement, seemed to think it was kind of a personal. He said, "Thank you for the compliment." He does not believe that other nations, based on the pushback over Greenland, would be there to protect us. Do you think he takes Rutte at his word?
I don't think he believes that. And you know, quite frankly, I think we're seeing a rupture in NATO. I mean, you look at the comments, and that's what I think's been so remarkable at Davos. You look at people like Mark Carney, you look at people like the UK finance minister, you look at others. They are starting to say that they don't think they can trust the US to be there for them. So I'm not so sure that Donald Trump is wrong when he says they may not be there for us. But of course, what he's not saying is that this is of his own doing, because to your point, they have been there for us for the last 80 years. And I think, you know, Mark Rutte is standing a little bit on his own there, still harboring the idea that if he hugs close to Donald Trump, he will get something out of it. And I'm not so sure many of our NATO and European allies feel that way anymore.
He did spend a lot of time thanking President Trump for preserving funding for NATO. Rick, what's going through your mind after you just heard this conversation? The U.S. has never doubted NATO allies in responding to an Article 5, has it?
No, and I don't think it will in the future. The debate isn't about the ability for NATO to continue to protect one another's interests. As you've pointed out, it rarely comes into effect, but when it does, there's not a question. And the NATO countries respond in kind. And certainly Donald Trump has not said anything that would actually give cause for the NATO countries to not think that the U.S. wouldn't be there, too. And I think you got to divorce some of this with just sort of the typical Trump grandstanding, trying to leverage Europe into a place where it hasn't wanted to be. Europe was not investing in their lethality. And now it's a much more lethal enterprise in NATO than it has ever been. And Trump spent a good part of his first term, you want to call it lobbying Europe, more like lobbing bombs at Europe. But and obviously he's been committed to doing that again in this last year. So it's how he gains leverage over these leaders is to be able to throw these insults. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but it's definitely a tactic. And I don't think you want to look too far past that tactic to see that things are actually improved in NATO since 2016.
Well, when we move past some of the insults that we heard this morning and some of the hot takes on data that Lael Brainard helped us understand, we're not always accurate. And of course, the president, Jeanne, is talking to a lot of people who are pretty smart in that room. These are world leaders and corporate leaders who know the data and they know the score. But it wasn't just about that. The president, when he got back on the script, started talking about the cultural implications of our economies, Jeanne. And I'm wondering your thoughts on this rhetoric. Listen to what he said.
The explosion of prosperity and conclusion and progress that built the West did not come from our tax codes. It ultimately came from our very special culture. This is the precious inheritance that America and Europe have in common. We share it. We share it, but we have to keep it strong. We have to become stronger, more successful, and more prosperous than ever. We have to defend that culture and rediscover the spirit that lifted the West from the depths of the Dark Ages to the pinnacle of human achievement.
This followed a pretty long rant insulting Somalia, which he said was not a real country, and talked about the impact of Somali migrants in the United States. When you consider that language, we have to defend that culture. Jeanne, what culture is he talking about?
You know, number one, I think he's talking about a culture that is scripted, and he is far less, in my mind, comfortable when he's forced to go back on script, which he was doing at that point. And what strikes me about that is if his real interest is in preserving the West and everything that has made the West what it is since World War II, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, since the end of the Cold War. Why is he doing everything he can to blow those relationships up? If that's his interest, why is he threatening to send American troops into Greenland? Obviously, before this speech, he has backed off from that. Why is he consistently telling our NATO allies that they wouldn't even be countries if it wasn't for the United States, that they have done nothing, that NATO has done nothing for the United States? So, you know, to me, this seems like what his political strategists want him to say, what his speechwriters want him to say, and he'll say it. But you can hear what he really wants to say is what he has said since 2016, that NATO is not serving the United States. We are serving it, and they owe us. That is Donald Trump's message to NATO. And I think for the first time, we are hearing European leaders wake up and say, you know what, we're going to take his rhetoric seriously. We aren't going to keep going and say, oh, he's just joking, or he's just using this crazy rhetoric to move us in a different direction. You see a split there, and you see Carney and others who are saying, I'm going to take him at his word, and we need to defend ourselves and look for allies in China and elsewhere.
Rick Davis, how should we interpret the cultural references? Are these the fingerprints of Stephen Miller on the script?
Yeah, I think that anytime the word culture comes out of Donald Trump's mouth, especially written in a speech, you can pretty much rest assured that that's coming from, you know, sort of the ideological center of the White House, which is Stephen Miller. And that is a reference to the Judeo-Christian values that are similar between the U.S. and Europe. It is not a modern conceit; it's an ancient conceit, and it's a bit of a dog whistle, you know, in today's domestic politics. So, in so much as they're embedded into this speech, some of these kinds of symbolism and messaging for the domestic U.S. audience, at least the MAGA audience, then you can be rest assured that that's going to make its way through social media by the end of today.
Always a great conversation with these two, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. That's why they are Bloomberg Politics contributors. We thank you both, of course, and we'll have a lot more throughout the day on the president's address and the impact on the markets. We'll get an update from Charlie Pellet coming up in just about 5 minutes' time, right here on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you for spending part of your Wednesday with us here on Balance of Power. With our eyes on Davos, we're going to have an important conversation coming up in just moments with Tommy Pigott, speaking for the State Department here in Washington on a day where geopolitics is, of course, leading the news, beginning with Greenland. But there's more. So much of the speech this morning in Davos has taken our attention away from the fact that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are going to be getting on an airplane tomorrow, traveling to Russia for talks with President Vladimir Putin on the latest proposals for peace to end the war in Ukraine. Now, of course, there is a lot of crossover here because many of these individuals, including these two, are in Davos. And Steve Witkoff, the president's special envoy, spent some time earlier today speaking with the team on Bloomberg surveillance. Here's part of their conversation.
Well, the Ukrainians have said that we're 90% done. And I agree with them. In fact, I think that we've made even more significant improvement over this past weekend. We were meeting with Kirill Butinov, who is, of course, their new vice president, ran military intelligence for them, their head of the parliament, David, and with Rustem Umerov. And we made even more progress during those meetings in Miami this past week. I'll be with them tonight. And I think that, and then I'm going to Moscow with Jared. All of these discussions are...
When are you going to Moscow?
Jared and I will leave Thursday night and arrive in Moscow late at night and then go over to the UAE afterwards for working groups.
So do you think we are close to the final 10% of this deal? Do you think this will get done in the next few weeks?
The final 10%, I don't know about the next few weeks, but I know we've made more progress in the last 6 or 7 weeks since Geneva than we've made, according to the Ukrainians now. I'm going to use their, what they say. According to the Ukrainians, more progress than in the last 3 or 4 years.
We've seen, though, Russia continue their attacks, especially on critical infrastructure, most recently energy infrastructure, leaving thousands, maybe millions of Ukrainians without power, without heat. Do you think Putin is truly here for a peace deal?
Well, first of all, they're in a war, and so they're shooting at each other, and we don't condone that. I mean, we think it's unfortunate. That's why the president and me with Jared at the president's direction, while working so hard for the peace. We hope that'll occur. We think people, you're right, are suffering on both sides. It's cold there, and not to have heat is terrible. And we've got to correct all of these things. But a peace deal corrects it, and the president is focused on that peace deal. It's a very, very important part of his agenda from a foreign policy standpoint.
But do you think Putin is there, or is he just dragging negotiations on for the sake of it?
I think that they've asked for the meeting. The Russians have invited us to come, and that's a significant statement from them. And Kirill was here yesterday and working on this with us. So I think everybody is embedded in the process and wants to see a peace deal happen.
All right, there you have it, directly from the source. Steve Witkoff speaking earlier today with Anne-Marie Hordern on Bloomberg TV and radio. He'll be on his way to Moscow tomorrow, as he mentioned, with Jared Kushner. This is where we start our conversation, but we have a lot more to discuss with Tommy Pigott, the State Department Principal Deputy Spokesperson, joining us now live from Washington. It's great to have you with us on Bloomberg, and I'd like to start with this meeting tomorrow, or at least the meetings that will be had once they arrive tomorrow in Moscow. What do you expect to come from this session?
Well, I'm not going to preview the outcome of those meetings. What I can say and stress is that President Trump's goal here is to end the bloodshed, to make it so people can go home and live prosperous lives with their families. That's why you've seen such engagement from the highest levels of this administration. Ultimately, we need to see negotiated settlement here. We're engaged in the serious exchange of ideas with both sides to try to reach that negotiated settlement. But it is up to the parties to reach that negotiated settlement and end this conflict.
Well, if we're 10% away, I'm just trying to get a sense of timeline here. I mean, it seems like a last mile story, and I know a lot of this has to do with security guarantees, with where lines are drawn. Do you share Mr. Witkoff's view? And could this 10% take longer than the first 90%?
Well, again, I'm not going to predict the future, but we've been involved for a very long time in the serious exchange of ideas with both sides of this conflict to try to see if that negotiated settlement is possible. As Witkoff has just explained, progress has been made in that regard. So we'll see where this goes, but ultimately, this is up to the parties to come together, reach that negotiated settlement, and end this conflict.
Sure. Is the administration's stated position that Russia is the aggressor?
The administration's stated position is that we want to see this conflict come to an end. That's what the president is doing. That's every single policy he has put into place is trying, regarding this conflict, is to try to bring it to an end, to end this bloodshed. He's commented repeatedly about the number of people that are dying and the fact that he views this war, as to use his word today, stupid that it keeps on going. It should end. So he wants to see this conflict come to an end. He wants people to go home and be with their families.
Well, I just ask you that because the president had mentioned as recently as last week that President Zelensky is the impediment to peace at this point. Is that how you view it?
Well, again, it's up to both sides of this conflict to come together and accept a negotiated settlement. That's how negotiated settlements work. We need to have both sides come together and agree.
And
we're engaged with the serious exchange.
The impediment
well, I mean,
to
we're
peace.
involved in the series of exchange in those ideas. So we're seeing this move forward. Wickoff just expressed how far we have come on this. So we're involved in that serious exchange of ideas and try to reach that negotiated settlement as soon as we can.
Okay. So I guess you don't have a stated position on that. I understand. And I just want to move on to Greenland, which is really what brought us here today, Tommy. This is what we thought we would be talking about with you. And I want to just bring everybody back to the president's speech this morning in Davos. We carried it live on Bloomberg. Listen.
We never asked for anything, and we never got anything. We probably won't get anything unless I decide to use excessive strength and force, where we would be, frankly, unstoppable. But I won't do that. Okay? Now everyone's saying, oh, good. That's probably the biggest statement I made, because people thought I would use force. I don't have to use force. I don't want to use force. I won't use force. All the United States is asking for is a place called Greenland. They have a choice. You can say yes, and we will be very appreciative, or you can say no, and we will remember.
Fascinating moment in that speech, and I'd love to ask you about what he meant by some of that. Tommy, the fact is, though, the president was just talking about this with reporters in Davos. The prime minister of Greenland says there will be no negotiation. So if force is off the table, what's the path here?
Well, the president has a variety of options at his disposal. We'll see how these conversations continue. The president's not afraid to have these hard conversations with our security partners. And that's exactly who the appropriate people are to have these conversations with, because it's a security issue. So he's identified a clear, compelling case of why ownership for Greenland is essential to the United States. I'm not going to rule out options for the president, but he has a whole host of options. He's discussed some of them already, and he's looking to make sure that the NATO alliance, Greenlanders, and the United States are all better off.
Well, I guess that's what I'm asking you. What are the options?
Well, the president has discussed tariffs as an option, for example. He has a whole suite of options available. And ultimately, what the president is focused on is making the case, as he did today, about the importance of the United States owning Greenland. The fact that each NATO partner, the primary responsibility they have is to defend their territory, and how the United States is the only NATO partner that is able to defend Greenland. So he's making that case. We're seeing those conversations happening. He's discussed some of those options already, but he has a whole array of options going forward, and a lot of that will determine about the reaction and conversations that he has.
I know he says he's going to be working with the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte. They were together, and I think they're still talking, as a matter of fact. Before cameras just a moment ago, he said he doesn't need to deal with the Prime Minister of Denmark. He will do this through Mark Rutte. So is NATO going to provide the path to figuring this out? And if the U.S. fails to acquire Greenland, will it leave NATO? Will it leave the alliance?
Well, ultimately, this is about enhancing the NATO alliance. We've seen a president from the beginning of this administration, even to his previous administration, calling for that 5% increase in NATO defense spending. Ultimately, this is about enhancing the security of Europe, Greenlanders, and the United States. And NATO has raised these concerns, as the president has indicated, to Denmark, to Greenland for a long time, about the modern-day threats we face in the Arctic, and how the United States, as the president has said, is the only power capable of defending Greenland. So this is about our security partnership, a stronger NATO, a stronger Europe, stronger Greenlanders, stronger United States.
How quickly should Americans expect Greenland to be a U.S. territory?
Well, the president's made clear it's a priority. I'm not going to predict the future again here, but it's a clear national security priority, essential in many ways to the security of the United States, from the Golden Dome perspective, to the modern weapons and threats that we're facing, to the encroachment from our adversaries. So it's clearly a priority from the president, and he's moving in that direction.
It's definitely a priority. And so what I really want to understand is the difference between the scenario we have now and the one that the president wants to achieve. Because defense positioning, our relationship militarily allows us to do kind of anything we want here when it comes to Greenland, does it not? We could build the Golden Dome using our existing relationship. What would a new one bring?
Well, two primary things. First, as I mentioned previously, the primary responsibility of each nation is to defend their territory. That's a primary responsibility they have. The United States is the only NATO partner capable of defending Greenland. So within the NATO structure itself, that leads to that argument. And the second is there are, of course, more capabilities that come from ownership, the ability to operate for a longer period of time. There are clear reasons why, from an operability standpoint, and then also within NATO itself, why the United States owning Greenland is so essential to national security. The only NATO partner that is able to combat the encroachment we're seeing from our adversaries, as well as address the modern weaponry, modern threats the president's discussed.
But isn't the U.S. already defending Greenland as a member of NATO?
Well, we have the NATO alliance there, but the president's talking about a stronger NATO. And like I mentioned, part of that responsibility, the primary responsibility of each country is to defend their territory. If the United States is the only partner capable of defending Greenland, which is the case, that lends to this argument itself, and that would therefore strengthen the alliance, as the president argued today.
But isn't that the essence of NATO? Wouldn't the Article 5 mean that we protect Greenland no matter what?
Well, there's certain operability, there's certain capabilities that come with ownership. So that's the second component. The first component, like I said, living up to the components of the NATO Charter regarding primary responsibilities in terms of defending territory. The second being the increased capabilities the United States has that allows for that defense, that makes sure that that can be defended, and can also counter the encroachment of our adversaries on Greenland. There are definitely capabilities and operability that comes from ownership, and the president's made those cases as well.
Interesting. In this case, the president said today he does not believe that NATO nations would stand up for the United States in the case of an Article 5 violation. He does know that there's only been one Article 5 violation, and it was to defend the United States, right? Didn't the Danes respond in that case?
Well, the president's making an argument about the modern threats that we face, and he's talking about Greenland in terms of the threats from the Arctic. He's clearly making an argument about enhancing the NATO alliance. And he's making an argument as well that he, as president, because of his leadership, we've seen a revitalized NATO alliance as well with that 5% defense spending. So those are the arguments that he's making. It's a modern day assessment of where our security priorities lie. And you need to have those conversations. You need to have conversations with your security partners. You can't ignore them. You need to have those conversations to ensure that our national security is protected.
Well, Mark Rutte said it pains him to think that Donald Trump thinks that our NATO nations would not respond to our benefit. Does the president feel differently now after hearing that?
Well, I'm not to comment for the president, given they're still in that meeting currently. I'll let him assess after the meeting in terms of describing it. But again, what I can stress is the president, as he said, we've been very good to NATO. We've seen the 5% increased commitments because of the president's leadership. And he's making an assessment of the current threats that we face and having these conversations with our security partners that we need to have. We can't ignore these conversations. We have to have them to address the modern threats we all face.
Well, we covered a lot of ground here, Tommy, and I appreciate your answering all of our questions. That's Tommy Pigott, State Department Principal Deputy Spokesperson, with us live on Bloomberg TV and radio. We thank you, and we're going to have a lot more on the late edition of Balance of Power as the president continues these bilateral meetings with world leaders. We'll have a full wrap-up for you. That starts at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and I hope that you'll be with us. Up next, Bloomberg Business Week Daily, live from New York. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. This is Bloomberg.